The date was November 12, 1943. Royal Navy Lieutenant Commander Reginald Hargreaves stood on the rain-slicked deck of HMS Blackwood, watching as massive chains strained against the Atlantic swell. A sodden team of sailors worked frantically to secure the prize, a jagged section of steel hull torn from a German U-boat that now lay 700 feet below. The metal gleamed darkly in the weak afternoon light, water cascading from its surface like mercury. Hargreaves ran his gloved hand along the edge, feeling the distinctive weld pattern that had become the signature of Nazi Germany's underwater fleet. "Careful with that section," he barked as the dripping piece of metal was finally pulled aboard. "This one's different." As the fragment was lowered onto the deck, the unmistakable crack of stressed metal echoed across the waves. What should have been merely fractured, splintering into razor-sharp shards that scattered across the wooden planks. The sailors jumped back in alarm. Hargreaves knelt, examining a piece with narrowed eyes. "Get this to Cambridge immediately," he ordered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "And contact Admiral Morrison." No one aboard the HMS Blackwood that bitter morning could have known that this twisted fragment of German engineering would upend everything the Royal Navy understood about the mysterious vanishing of dozens of U-boats in the North Atlantic, or that one engineer's defiance of scientific orthodoxy would turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. Hargreaves stared at the horizon, where slate-gray sea met charcoal sky. "Something's not right with this steel," he muttered, "and I intend to find out what." Weir, the man who would eventually unravel the mystery of the vanishing U-boats, came from remarkably ordinary beginnings. Victor Edmund Stanton was born on March 5, 1907, in the coal-mining town of Sheffield, England, a city synonymous with steel production since the Industrial Revolution. His father, a foreman at the local foundry, would bring home offcuts of metal for young Victor to examine, sparking a lifelong fascination with metallurgy. At 16, Stanton left school to apprentice at the Sheffield Steel Works, where 12-hour shifts in blistering heat and choking coal dust forged both steel and character. Unlike most of his peers, Stanton spent his evenings at the local library, devouring books on chemistry and material science. A supervisor noticed his unusual dedication and arranged a scholarship to the University of Manchester. "He wasn't like the other students," recalled Professor James Thornburn, who taught Stanton metallurgical engineering from 1926 to 1929. Most came from privileged backgrounds and had never seen the inside of a working mill. Stanton knew steel not just from books but in his bones, how it behaved when stressed, how it responded to temperature, how impurities changed its character. He had what we called the foundry sense. After graduating with first-class honors, Stanton joined the British Steel Corporation's research division. His colleagues found him peculiar, a man who preferred the company of microscopes and stress-testing equipment to people who could identify the origin of a steel sample by examining its fracture pattern, and who kept meticulous notebooks filled with observations about metallurgical anomalies. He was brilliant, but utterly lacking in social graces, remembered Millicent Harwell, who worked as his laboratory assistant in the 1930s. He would go days without speaking, then suddenly burst into detailed explanations of molecular structures that left everyone baffled. But when it came to understanding why metals failed under stress, there was no one better. Stanton's career proceeded unremarkably until 1938, when he published a controversial paper challenging accepted theories about stress fractures in high-carbon steel alloys. The academic establishment dismissed his findings as foundry folklore dressed up as science. Disheartened, Stanton might have faded into academic obscurity had war not intervened. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Stanton volunteered immediately, expecting to be assigned to an engineering battalion. Instead, he received orders to report to a nondescript government building in Whitehall. There, in a basement office, Admiral Walter Sullivan informed him that he had been drafted into a classified Admiralty program. "You won't be wearing a uniform, Stanton," Sullivan explained. "Your battlefield will be the laboratory, and your weapon will be that extraordinary mind of yours. We need you to help us understand how German submarines are built, and more importantly, how to sink them." Within days, Stanton was installed at a secret facility in Cambridge, codenamed Station Zeta, where a team of British engineers and scientists worked to understand the enemy's technology. Little did they know that Victor Stanton's unconventional thinking would eventually lead to one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic represented the Allies' most pressing existential threat in the early years of the war. Winston Churchill later wrote, "The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril, and for good reason. Britain was an island nation that imported 70% of its food and virtually all its oil and industrial materials. If the German submarine wolf packs succeeded in cutting these maritime lifelines, the United Kingdom would be forced to surrender within months." By early 1941, the situation had grown desperate. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. In the grim calculus of war, British Admiralty reports showed that for every U-boat destroyed, 19 merchant ships were lost. Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarines prowled the Atlantic with near impunity, hunting in coordinated wolf packs that overwhelmed convoy escorts. The heart of Germany's underwater fleet was the Type 7 submarine, a masterpiece of naval engineering. 769 tons of precision-crafted steel, powered by twin 1,400 horsepower diesel engines on the surface and electric motors when submerged. With a crush depth estimated at 700 feet and armed with 14 torpedoes, a single Type 7 could devastate a merchant convoy before disappearing into the depths. The German Navy had begun rebuilding its submarine fleet in 1935 after Adolf Hitler repudiated the Treaty of Versailles that had forbidden such weapons. The naval architects had made significant improvements over their World War I predecessors. As the research at Station Zeta revealed, the new U-boats utilized welded hulls rather than riveted construction, giving them stronger pressure hulls and allowing them to dive deeper than any previous submarines. The Germans had achieved something remarkable, noted Commander Phineas Atherton of British Naval Intelligence in a classified report dated June 7, 1941. Their submarines combined speed, range, and diving capability in a way that made them nearly perfect predators. Unless we find their weakness, we may well lose this war beneath the waves. The turning point came on May 9, 1941, when the crew of the British destroyer HMS Bulldog boarded the stricken German submarine U-110. In a daring raid, Royal Navy sailors recovered the submarine's Enigma cipher machine and codebooks before the vessel sank, a prize of incalculable intelligence value. But they also retrieved something that would prove equally valuable: metallurgical samples from the U-boat's pressure hull. These samples eventually found their way to Victor Stanton's laboratory at Station Zeta. For 3 weeks, he subjected the fragments to every test available to 1940s science: microscopic examination, chemical analysis, stress testing, and crystallographic studies. What he discovered contradicted everything the Admiralty believed about German engineering. The hull samples show a distinctive high-carbon steel alloy with significant chromium and molybdenum content, Stanton wrote in his report. But there is an anomaly in the crystalline structure, a brittleness that should not be present in a submarine designed to withstand extreme pressure gradients. I believe this indicates a critical vulnerability in the German manufacturing process. Stanton's superiors were skeptical. German engineering was renowned for its precision and quality. The idea that the Reich's vaunted submarine fleet might contain a fundamental materials flaw seemed far-fetched. Stanton's report was filed away, deemed interesting but inconclusive. The submarine war continued to rage across the Atlantic. By late 1942, improved Allied tactics, airborne radar, and the breaking of German naval codes had begun to turn the tide. Yet still, too many merchant ships were being lost, and too few U-boats destroyed. Something more was needed to break the back of Dönitz's wolf packs. Everything changed in November 1943, when HMS Blackwood recovered the hull section that had so startled Lieutenant Commander Hargreaves. The fragment was immediately dispatched to Station Zeta, where it landed on Victor Stanton's desk. For 72 hours, he worked without sleeping, conducting test after test on the mysterious sample. What he discovered would alter the course of the Battle of the Atlantic forever. The tension in the Admiralty conference room was palpable as Victor Stanton prepared to present his findings on December 3, 1943. Admiral Morrison sat at the head of the polished oak table, surrounded by naval officers whose gold braid and ribbons contrasted sharply with Stanton's rumpled civilian suit. The only sounds were the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock and the rustling of papers as Stanton organized his notes. "Gentlemen," Stanton began, his Sheffield accent standing out amid the cultured tones of the naval elite, "what I am about to show you explains why German U-boats have been mysteriously disappearing in the North Atlantic, vessels that, by all accounts, were not attacked by our forces." He placed a piece of the recovered hull on the table, alongside a sample of British submarine steel for comparison. The Germans have been using a specialized high-tensile steel alloy for their pressure hulls, similar to what we saw in the samples from U-110 2 years ago. On paper, it's impressive, stronger than our own submarine steel, allowing for deeper diving depths and thinner hull walls. Admiral Morrison leaned forward. "That's hardly news, Stanton. German metallurgical superiority has been a concern since the war began." "With respect, Admiral, that superiority is an illusion," Stanton replied, adjusting his spectacles. "The Germans have sacrificed material resilience for strength. Their steel contains excessive carbon content, nearly 0.4%, along with chromium and molybdenum additives designed to increase tensile strength. But these same elements make the steel catastrophically brittle at low temperatures." He lifted a small hammer and struck the British sample, which bent under the impact. Then he placed the German sample in a container of ice water, waited 30 seconds, and struck it with the same force. The metal shattered like glass, fragments scattering across the polished table. The room fell silent. "Gentlemen, we've been assuming that German engineering is flawless. It isn't. Their submarines are built with a fatal flaw, a steel alloy that becomes dangerously brittle at the temperatures found in the deep North Atlantic, particularly in winter months. Commander Gregory Kingston, the Admiralty's chief of anti-submarine warfare, looked skeptical. "Are you suggesting that U-boats are simply breaking apart on their own?" "Not exactly," Stanton replied. "The steel maintains structural integrity until subjected to sudden pressure changes, such as those experienced during emergency dives or when depth charges explode nearby. Even if our depth charges detonate outside the lethal radius, the shock wave could induce catastrophic hull failure in cold waters." He unfolded a chart of the North Atlantic marked with red dots. "These are locations where U-boats have vanished without confirmed kills by our forces. Notice the pattern. They cluster in regions where deep water temperatures drop below 3 degrees Celsius. The correlation is unmistakable." Admiral Morrison studied the map, his expression grave. "If this is true, it represents a vulnerability we must exploit immediately. How certain are you of these findings, Stanton?" "The metallurgical evidence is conclusive, sir. I've tested 17 different samples from 3 different U-boats. The results are consistent. German submarine steel suffers from low-temperature embrittlement. They've built their underwater fleet with a fatal weakness that becomes more pronounced the deeper they dive and the colder the water. The implications were enormous. If Stanton was correct, Allied anti-submarine forces could adjust their tactics to exploit this weakness, forcing U-boats to make emergency dives into cold, deep water, then subjecting them to depth-charge attacks calibrated not to destroy the submarines directly, but to create pressure differentials that would trigger catastrophic hull failures. "There's something else, gentlemen," Stanton continued. "The Germans don't know about this flaw. Their steel testing protocols don't account for combined pressure and temperature effects. They've built their entire submarine strategy on a technological foundation that literally cracks under pressure." A murmur ran through the room. If true, this discovery could change everything. But implementing a new tactical doctrine based on Stanton's theory would require convincing skeptical convoy commanders to fundamentally change their approach to anti-submarine warfare. "We need proof," Admiral Morrison declared. "Theoretical metallurgy won't convince hardened naval officers to abandon tactics they've trained years to perfect. We need a demonstration under combat conditions." Stanton nodded. "You've anticipated this, sir. I've designed a modified depth charge with a smaller explosive charge but enhanced pressure wave characteristics. It won't destroy a U-boat through direct damage, but in cold, deep water it should induce exactly the kind of hull failure I've described." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. They were discussing a weapon designed not to explode against enemy vessels, but to exploit a material science vulnerability that the Germans themselves didn't know existed. "How soon can these modified charges be ready?" Morrison asked. "Production can begin immediately. I've already prepared the specifications." The Admiral nodded slowly. "Very well, Stanton. You'll have your demonstration. But if this fails, the resources wasted could cost us dearly in the Atlantic campaign." As the meeting adjourned, Commander Kingston approached Stanton. "You realize what's at stake? Your entire professional reputation for starters." Stanton packed his papers methodically. "With respect, Commander, I'm concerned with saving ships and sailors, not my reputation. The evidence doesn't lie. German U-boat steel fails catastrophically under specific conditions we can now reproduce. They built their submarines to withstand direct explosive force, but overlooked basic metallurgical principles regarding temperature-dependent brittleness." Kingston studied the civilian engineer thoughtfully. "For all our sakes, I hope you're right." "Oh, neither man could have predicted how dramatically Stanton's discovery would alter the underwater war, or how many lives would hang in the balance as his theories were put to the ultimate test." Operation Fracture, the classified program to exploit the newfound vulnerability in German submarine design, began in January 1944, amid the bitter cold of the North Atlantic winter. The first modified depth charges, designed according to Stanton's specifications, were loaded aboard the destroyer HMS Venerable as it prepared to escort convoy HX-279 from Halifax to Liverpool. Captain Maxwell Cunningham of the Venerable had been personally briefed by Admiral Morrison. Like most escort commanders, he received the new tactical doctrine with skepticism. "You're telling me to deliberately set my charges to explode at greater distances from the target?" he had questioned during the briefing. "Everything in my experience says that's precisely how to let a U-boat escape." "I understand your reservations, Captain," Morrison had replied, "but these are not standard depth charges. They're designed to create specific pressure differentials in the water column. Trust the science." On January 23, 1944, convoy HX-279 encountered a wolf pack of 5 German submarines 200 nautical miles southeast of Iceland. The water temperature at 300 feet was 1 degree Celsius, perfect conditions for Stanton's theory to be tested. As U-598 closed in for an attack on the merchant vessel SS Empire Mandarin, HMS Venerable moved to intercept. Captain Cunningham, despite his misgivings, deployed the modified depth charges according to the new protocol, set to detonate at distances that conventional wisdom deemed ineffective. Sonar operator First Class Philip Davenport manned his station aboard the Venerable as the attack unfolded. Contact holding steady at bearing 275, depth 300 feet, speed 8 knots, he reported into his headset. Release pattern Baker 3, ordered Captain Cunningham, referring to the modified deployment sequence. 6 depth charges descended into the frigid waters, timed to detonate in a precise pattern around the U-boat's projected position, but crucially, not directly underneath it, as traditional tactics dictated. The charges detonated with muffled thumps that reverberated through the Venerable's hull. For 30 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Cunningham exchanged a look with his executive officer, both men thinking the same thing. The new tactics had failed. Then Davenport's voice cut through the tension. "Sir, unusual sounds from target. Metal stress. Creaking." His voice rose in pitch. "Breaking up noises. She's imploding, sir." The control room erupted in astonished exclamations as the sonar clearly registered the unmistakable sounds of a submarine being crushed by water pressure, the hull collapsing inward as its structural integrity failed catastrophically. "My God," whispered Cunningham. Stanton was right. Within 48 hours, 3 more U-boats from the same wolf pack had been destroyed using the modified depth charges. None had been directly hit. All had suffered hull failures after being subjected to the precise pressure differentials that Stanton had predicted would exploit their steel's brittleness in cold water. Word spread quickly through the escort fleet. Operation Fracture moved from experimental to standard doctrine. By March 1944, all North Atlantic convoy escorts had been equipped with the modified depth charges and trained in the new tactical approach. The effect was immediate and devastating. U-boat losses skyrocketed while attacks on merchant shipping plummeted. Admiral Donitz, unaware of the metallurgical flaw that had been exposed, attributed the sudden reversal to improved Allied radar and air coverage. He ordered his submarines to operate farther south, in warmer waters, unwittingly confirming Stanton's theories about temperature-dependent brittleness. In a desperate attempt to counter the inexplicable losses, German naval engineers increased the thickness of pressure hull plates on new construction U-boats, a move that made them heavier and slower, without addressing the fundamental materials science issue. By June 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively been won. U-boats still operated, but their effectiveness had been neutered. Convoy losses dropped to their lowest levels of the war. The critical supply lines to Britain remained open, enabling the massive buildup of men and materiel needed for the D-Day landings and the liberation of Europe. And through it all, the true nature of Operation Fracture remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of World War II. Victor Stanton never received public recognition for his pivotal contribution to the Allied victory. His work remained classified for decades, known only to a handful of naval officers and scientists. After the war, he returned to Sheffield Steel Works, where he continued his research into metallurgical failures until his retirement in 1967. In 1953, a German metallurgist named Heinrich Gruber, examining preserved fragments of U-boat hulls, independently discovered the same material vulnerability that Stanton had identified a decade earlier. His paper, Temperature-Dependent Brittleness in High-Carbon Naval Steels, was published to little notice outside specialized scientific circles. The story of how British engineers had discovered and exploited a fatal flaw in German submarine construction remained largely unknown until the declassification of Admiralty records in the 1990s. Even then, it received little attention compared to more dramatic narratives of convoy battles and heroic rescues. Yet the discovery illustrates one of the war's most important lessons. That victory often hinged not just on courage and sacrifice, though these were abundant, but on the quiet application of scientific principles by individuals whose names rarely appeared in headlines. For the men who served aboard escort vessels like HMS Venerable, the modified depth charges represented salvation, a way to neutralize the underwater predators that had claimed so many of their comrades. For the merchant sailors whose ships completed their voyages safely because of Operation Fracture, Stanton's metallurgical insights meant the difference between life and death. In his modest home in Sheffield after the war, Stanton kept a small display case containing a fragment of U-boat hull steel, a reminder of how understanding the molecular properties of metal had helped change the course of the history's greatest conflict. When asked about his wartime service by those few aware of his role, he would typically deflect with a self-deprecating comment about merely pointing out the obvious to those too busy fighting to notice. But the numbers tell a different story. In the 6 months before Operation Fracture began, 47 Allied merchant vessels were lost to U-boat attacks in the North Atlantic. In the 6 months after, that number fell to 11. Meanwhile, German submarine losses increased by 78%. The true impact of Stanton's discovery can perhaps best be measured in the cargo that safely reached British shores, the food that prevented starvation, the fuel that powered factories, the ammunition and vehicles that eventually helped liberate Europe. Each ton of supplies delivered represented lives saved and the preservation of freedom against tyranny. In the grand narrative of World War II, the Battle of the Atlantic stands as a testament to human endurance and ingenuity, a years-long struggle against nature's fury and man's technological prowess, turned to destructive ends. That the tide was turned not just by courage but by scientific insight speaks to the multifaceted nature of modern warfare. The steel that failed beneath the Atlantic waves had been forged in the foundries of a nation that prided itself on engineering excellence. Its vulnerability remained invisible until a man who had begun his career in the smoke and fire of Sheffield steel mills applied his unique understanding of metallurgy to the greatest naval challenge of the age. Victor Stanton died in 1976, his contribution to victory known to only a handful of people. His obituary in the Sheffield Telegraph made no mention of Operation Fracture or the Battle of the Atlantic. It described him simply as a dedicated metallurgist who contributed to advancements in steel manufacturing. Perhaps that understated epitaph would have suited him. Throughout his life, Stanton maintained that he had done nothing extraordinary, merely observed what the evidence revealed and drawn the necessary conclusions. That his observations helped save countless lives and shorten a devastating war was, to him, incidental to the pursuit of scientific truth. Yet his story reminds us that in war, as in peace, the course of human events often turns not on grand strategies conceived in imposing war rooms, but on the specialized knowledge of individuals who see what others miss. A metallurgist who understood why steel fails, an insight that changed history. As you reflect on this little-known chapter of World War II, consider this question. How many other quiet heroes, men and women whose specialized knowledge proved decisive in moments of crisis, remain uncelebrated in our collective memory of the past? And how might such expertise, cultivated in times of peace, prove crucial in future challenges? The U-boats that disappeared beneath the Atlantic waves, their steel hulls fracturing under pressures they were supposedly designed to withstand, stand as a warning against technological overconfidence and a testament to the power of scientific observation. Share this story so others may remember what true innovation looks like. Not always in creating something new, but sometimes in understanding why what exists already may fail when we need it most.